Philosophers talk to our times. I'm going to take a break from the dystopia series. I'm tired of talking of dystopia. In the end, it bores me. We're in it. Deal with it. And go back, as I always do at that point, to Spinoza. And to that debt I deliberately left myself with, of going back to think about common notions. Where they come from and why they matter. And why they're not reducible to Bergson and Elan Vitals. And how they pull Spinoza away from the genius interpretation that Deleuze foisters on him. So this will be a little technical. It also, to be frank, will be chaotic. Because the point is that in order to understand what makes Spinoza different, I have to go further into understanding Bergson than I'm comfortable with. I studied Bergson a lot in my early 30s. Creative evolution and all that stuff. And I actually rather liked Twin Source of Morality and Matter of Memory. Twin Source was what I read first, actually. But I only became into my own as a philosopher when I gave up and forgot and didn't bother thinking about him anymore. Because I actually find him a poison. He makes things feel too easy. But I was reminded this morning, when I was busy working out something to say about dystopia, that Deleuze gets his example of common notions from Bergson. Just to remind you, Deleuze's example of a common notion is swimming. As you swim, you enter into an engagement with water. You're in some sort of dialogue with water. Fine, you go. Now, with my own personal head on, I'm ambivalent about it. I'm ambivalent because I always wondered why Deleuze chose water. Was it because we're 96% water or whatever? And so somehow the commonality was there? Deleuze never says it. And if he did, I'd crucify him. But I have the suspicion that he thinks it. But anyway, perhaps he didn't, because actually that's Bergson's example of an illustration of the elan vital at work. Bergson says you could not deduce from walking swimming, and therefore swimming involves something greater, something you can't quite learn from all the experience of walking, an engagement with the world beyond. And again, I remember it's just technically, I'm slightly ambivalent about that. It's certainly true. If you're a human, you can't get an immediate affinity between walking and swimming. But you can if you're a dog. But that's totally beside the point. That's just me being petty. And that made me think, hang on a minute then. If Deleuze is putting right at his core of common notions, Bergson, I really do actually have to start any thought about common notions with Bergson, with what he shares with Spinoza and what he absolutely doesn't. So just to remind you about Bergson, now, as I said, I haven't thought about Bergson in, 25 years. So I am incredibly rusty. But my memory of him is that he is the master at understanding, or attempting to understand, or attempting to reposition our understanding of the world. Not in terms of orders that get followed. Not in terms of a secret genetic code that then gets unpulled so that we're all defined and refined. But rather in terms of the motion itself. A swallow is not told by its inner genetics, I must fly south. It is in the essence of the swallow, in the being of the swallow, that you are in the flying. And yes, there will be a genetic element, no doubt, but there will be an element of the warmth upon the swallow's skin, the ebbing warmth of summer, and some beckoning of the south. You understand then what it is to be a swallow, not in terms of a creature that gets impelled by some deep instinct it doesn't understand, if that which ultimately has a genetic origin, but rather in terms of the temporalities of one swallow that is, and all the swallows that ever were, caught up within themselves, within the motion, so that you understand things through their motion, through the way that they are slices of time. And to be alive is to be always within a slice of time. And that takes one on to the way Deleuze uses Bergson. Deleuze uses Bergson as the great thinker of difference that is not Hegelian difference. So that Bergson, for him, provides a way of having continuity and then slicing it, literally having your cake and eating it. So Bergson, for me, is a thinker of continuity. The elan vital, the great initial force that erupts into being, that gives us a force of life. It isn't quite life force, but endlessly differs as it is, in my reading of Bergson, always just a continuity. It's understanding the world as he understands certainly duration, as the continuity of the moment, unsplittable, so that no moment is ever truly lost, because there is no smallest unit of time. Not really. There is a moment which is a contraction of all the times that have led before it, and so can be left and then refound. But there is no smallest moment of time. There is only duration, and that which erupts within duration. Now, Deleuze changes that. He changes that into a theory of difference, because Deleuze is much more interested in the differences that drive duration. What is it that makes this moment different from that moment? And so he turns Bergson into a wonderful theory of difference, into a theory where what matters is qualitative differences. So different ways you can extend time. In my vague attack on Bergson yesterday, on the matter of memory, you could defend Bergson. I was doing it all of yesterday, which is why I think I had to go back to him today. You could defend him very clearly and say what Bergson talks about is different contractions of memory. Different ways it's extended and contracted, each different in kind, so that the way you remember an epoch and the way you remember a day have very different rhythms, create different eddies in your mind, different ways of being. And time, when it splits into difference of kind, so that one epoch, one way of splitting time is not reconcilable straight with another way of understanding it. It's qualitative. It's qualitative and distinct changes. And all that jazz. Now, Deleuze puts an entire scaffold of philosophy on top of that. And it's wonderful. And he uses it to understand Spinoza. Because in his notions of the way he treats conatas, the way he treats essence and the capacity to act, the way he treats attribute and substance, it's just Bergson. He is importing Bergson into Spinoza to create a philosophy that is wonderful, beautiful. But I've never felt it had much to do with Spinoza. Not really. If Spinoza wanted to talk that way, he would have done so, and he doesn't. It's not that he didn't have the tools. He probably did. Certainly, if he talked to Leibniz, he would have had the tools. Because you can get that philosophy from a conversation between Spinoza and Leibniz. Yes, you can. In many ways, Deleuze spends his life eavesdropping that conversation as he's imagining it. Well, that one night they meet in 1677, when Spinoza is dying, or will be dead within a year, and Leibniz is a young man. Yeah, absolutely. But it's still not for me what Spinoza does. Why? Spinoza isn't a theoretician of continuity at any point. He explains continuity, and he has an elaborate explanation of it. But he isn't interested in it as a vital force in its own right. His vital is elsewhere. That means that Spinoza makes important distinctions that are kind of lost in Bergson between maths of living things and non-living things. And they're there in Spinoza, as much as they were in Leibniz, out of interest. Now, this goes against the grain of a normal way that Spinoza is interpreted, and I am thoroughly aware of that. And to understand it, we will have to go through rather too much of the first book of ethics than I like talking about on this channel. Because it's complicated, it's technical, it takes you here, it takes you there. But Spinoza spends a lot of time in that first book talking about attributes and substance as somehow distinct from each other and somehow caught up within each other, and how you understand the two. Now, for my own personal reading, I would say that substance is always the absolute middle. It is the middle of being in the middle. It is always being caught up within itself. So that is an eruptive middle. It is one that places itself in the middle of itself. So always doing, always changing, always being. Aha, you say, sounds like Bergson, maybe. But it has no continuity of its own. It doesn't express its own existence. It is its own existence. It is being caught up within the middle of itself. Attributes that perceive the essence of substance then understand that eruption in terms of a single unity, a single slice that allows you to understand it. So that attributes understand the essence of substance in its existence. They give its endless ability to change as a single thing. It is a one thing that is changing. This is very Plotinus, but it's Plotinus going in the opposite direction. It is the many that is many that is many, and all alone. And it is the one then that grasps the many, and not the other way round. That's why Spinoza spends so much time towards the end of Book 1 of Ethics talking about attributes and how the essence and existence of God are seen as one as the same. So the continuity, the reality of God given in the attributes, given as a single thing, that single thing is an expression of his essence, which is always erupting, always different. Spinoza then is seeing a tension between any theory of difference, which is attention. I think I'm comfortable with the word tension, and we'll come on to why it's tension in a minute, although I'm aware that this is going to be a very long piece. I'll try to keep it to under 20 minutes, and I'll just then stop and we'll go on to tomorrow. I always knew it'd be like this. This is why I've put it off doing it. I think I would put it as a tension between attributes and substance. They're not the same thing. Substance is simply the being in the middle. It is the absolute middle, thought in its completeness. Incompleteness, incomplete completeness, whatever you want to say, in the fact that it can never complete itself. It's always caught up within itself. And continuity is then the way you grasp at that difference. Okay, but they remain distinct. And an attribute can never fully express all that a substance is in that substance, the absolute middle, as it is in the absolute middle, could always have other ways of being expressed. Therefore, there is theoretically an infinite number of attributes. No one attribute, every attribute will incorporate, understand, capture in one single glance the essence of substance without being totally reconcilable to what that substance is. This is why Spinoza often gets very confused when people say, well, are there lots of attributes or are there not? In a sense, for Spinoza, that's not quite the question. The point is the difference between the attribute that gives the singularity to continuity and substance that is always elsewhere, that is an eruptive, changing force. And this is where I would certainly agree with Deleuze. It gives the power of the idea of God, which Spinoza calls proceedeth from God, and is the idea that is the idea of God as understood as, he calls it an objective, you would probably call it a subjective idea, just as it is experienced in perception. And the perception of God then will gather all of the things that God is into one single attribute, into one single thought, without ever really getting to all that God could be. The absolute middle could always have other ways of understanding it, always other ways of being. And so there is a kind of at the beginning of, I think it's the beginning of book 2, right at the beginning of book 2 of Ethics, yes, there is this kind of weirdness where substance, in order to understand substance's essence, you have attributes which understand that essence as a single thing, as actually existing, as a continuity. But there is, turn it around, and one essence, as it exists under the power of God, under the idea of God, could be understood in a myriad different attributes. And so thought itself is capable of thinking the attributes of the essence of God a billion different ways. It is in its own absolute middle. So there's an absolute middle of objective thought that never can ever quite describe or finish or say that this way of understanding God is the one true way of understanding God, because it doesn't really work like that. My point here is really not the existence of every attribute, which was the way that someone like Leibniz gets obsessed about this. That's not the point. The point is that the way difference is being driven by objective idea and the way difference that is driven by substance, so the difference that is giving continuity and the difference that is giving actuality are distinct differences. They're differently different, if you like. Oh, they're complementary. They're caught up within the same absolute middle. They're all part of the same absolute middle. But the minute you move away from understanding the absolute middle, the minute you're trying to comprehend its existence, you start drawing out distinct realms, reams, ways of being different. And yes, the attribute of thought remains an attribute. Absolutely, it expresses the essence of God. But it is an attribute that, as part of its rhythm, contains as what immediately proceeds from it, the idea of God, can express that thing in infinite different ways, which is the formula Spinoza tries to hit upon. As he says, it is difficult to understand. It is ultimately terribly singular. Some days I think I do understand it, some days I don't, but I can see the distinction he is making. It is a way in which substance is caught up within its own idea of itself as necessarily existing. Now, whether you want to go full along on that metaphysics or not, I don't care really, because actually Spinoza makes a better distinction later on the relation of finite existence. And this is the distinction that he's making, I think, that allows him to separate living things from unliving things, which is why I think he makes it. Ideas, the idea of a stone, of something inanimate, certainly exists. And it exists across, but it is the idea of the thing, for instance, a stone, is not in the stone itself. It is rather in everything else that looks upon the stone. Spinoza is very clear. The train of causation, okay, and the train of ideas are what is the same. So you perceive a stone because of the way that stone affects you. It might not affect you at all, and then you'll barely perceive it. But it's flying towards you, you'll perceive it. So that you perceive it by how it is actually caught up in its affection of you. And that's the way objective ideas work. They're not in the thing themselves. They're in everything else looking at the thing. Okay? This matters. It matters because it means that Spinoza doesn't have the problem of a stone having a mind. It doesn't have a mind. It is in the mind of something else. What makes mind, Spinoza says, is something very peculiar. It is the idea of the body as it actually exists. Now that's something terribly distinct. A body that is actually existing. It is not that the body exists. You have no adequate idea of anything that makes your body, of all the individuals involved within it. It is in the actual existence, because the idea of the actual existence contains the perception of that actual existence within the idea of actually existing, so that the two are given together. They're given in the same idea. So that means the idea, the perception of the thing, and the attribute of the thing are caught up in the same idea. That makes what in Spinoza makes an adequate idea. That's why we can have an adequate idea, an intuitive feeling of our essence. That is what drives common notions. So my point is here, if you can get through the jargon, and as I say, I'm always anxious about this jargon. This was me at my last phase of thinking, before epilepsy or whatever ate my mind, and it is at its most intricate because there's a whole sequence of levels moving on, so that it makes it tricky to work out the level you're working on. And I'm not sure, if I'm brutally honest with myself, I was never quite sure that I carried the argument, that I could trace out all the complexities. But that is the distinctions he's making. It's clear in ethics, and they are clearly a very different set of distinctions from the kind that Deleuze would even dream of making. And that matters. It matters because that opens Spinoza up away from the Bergsonianism that Deleuze wants to foist it on him, and allows him to say something really quite distinct, quite different. I say that without full respect to Deleuze. I think Deleuze, I would never have started to analyse Spinoza as I did if I hadn't finally have understood expressionism. And it really was expressionism. It was really understanding the way that Deleuze repeatedly went back to Spinoza across the course of a life. He does it 3 times. Each time he rereads Spinoza in the light of Leibniz. But each time, because he reads it in the light of Leibniz, he gives a interpretation that has got very little to do with Spinoza. And it was understanding how it didn't have anything to do with Spinoza, how it made me very uneasy, that I think gave me the impetus to reread Spinoza and to understand the distinctions that he has made. I'll come back to this. I'm not absolutely convinced I'll do Common Notions tomorrow, if I'm honest with you. But we're getting there. We'll move around. It will depend on how I think about Bergson today, because I'm going to spend a day thinking about what I want to say about the Elan Vital and Common Notions, really. Now I've made Spinoza more difficult again, before we get back to proper Common Notions and what makes them distinct, and the mutuality of what it is to be at all. All right, so slight change in tempo in the series, but hey, whatever. I tend to go with what my brain will do at any particular time, and I just thought we could get this one in while it was thinking about it.